Thank you, Tara, and thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. I've been down to Santa Cruz a couple of times now to give talks, and I love this area, and I'm a huge fan of MBEP, and Tara, in particular, your housing initiatives I find really, truly exciting. So thanks for having me here. And I want to echo the sentiment about being back in person. I can't tell you how many Zoom talks I've given in the last few years, and the conversations that you have when you're in person are just so much better. Okay, you're not here to listen to me wax on about being in person or Zoom or what have you. Let's talk about the economy. I'm going to talk about economic indicators. We're going to start out at the 30,000 foot level. We'll talk about what's going on in the US economy. We'll talk about inflation. I know inflation is top of mind for most people, so we'll talk about that, talk about what the Federal Reserve is doing. I'll talk a little bit about what I think is keeping it a little bit higher than we like it to be and prospects for it going down. And then we're going to drill down into the local economy. Okay, so in terms of the US economy, the big picture number is that of GDP. Right, GDP came out last week for the first quarter of this year. Came out a little disappointing at about 1.6%, but when you dig down, it's not all that disappointing. I won't go into the details of why it's okay, but it has to do with inventories. They built up at the last half of last year, and we sold them. And when that happens, that gets credited to last year and not to the first quarter of this year. So that's part of why we had really solid growth in the second half of last year, 4.9% in the third quarter and 3.4% in the fourth quarter. So I'm not worried about the 1.6% number. I'm not worried about Q2 being lower. And I'm not as optimistic as some people out there are. The Atlanta Fed has a forecast of 3.8% growth for the second quarter. I'll be surprised if we get 3.8%. It'll be great if we do, I think. But I'll be surprised. Probably in the 2 to 3 range is what I would guess. I want to talk a little bit about our recovery from the pandemic. Right? We had a big pandemic plunge in GDP. Well, by my analysis, we've completely recovered. So on this graph, there's the red line, and that's my projection of where GDP should have, would have, maybe could have been in the absence of the pandemic. And the blue line shows you where we went, right? Big deviation in the first couple of quarters of 2020, and we've been trying to catch up ever since. Well, the lines are now so close that I'm really willing to say mission accomplished, job done. The economy is back on more or less normal footing and back to where GDP would have been. Let's talk a little bit more about that Q1 number. Right, so everybody who's ever had a macroeconomics class probably had embedded in your mind y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m. Hopefully you've all forgotten that, but those are sort of the 5 components in the identity of what grows GDP. The most important is consumption. We're a consumer-driven economy. As consumers go, largely so goes the economy. In the first quarter of 2024, consumption drove 1.7% of GDP growth. So that's a little bit more than all of GDP growth. And that's okay. It still adds up because we take imports out, right? Imports are in there as minus. It's not because imports are bad. It's just for accounting. Some of what we consume, we imported from other countries, right? So consumption 1.7%, but that's down. It's normally around 2.3%. Which is a little bit of a source of concern for me. Consumers have been largely driving the recovery. Government throughout most of 2023 was also very helpful in driving the economy. But if consumers are pulling back, right? Consumers had a lot of pent up money from the pandemic. Government threw $5 trillion out there and household balance sheets were in pretty good shape. Well, I think that's kind of coming to an end. I think that most households that had a lot of excess savings, those who aren't rich, have largely spent through most of it. Right? And what we're seeing is retail, personal consumption expenditures going up at a moderate pace, and that's fine. It looks okay. But when you look at household balance sheets, that's where I start to get a little bit more concerned. Right? What a lot of people did with the money the federal government gave them was pay down credit cards, which is awesome because that's really bad debt. But that's done now, and credit card debt is up a little bit higher than it was pre-pandemic. They've also bought new houses, so there's a lot of mortgage debt out there now, which isn't necessarily problematic for household balance sheets, but it's out there. One thing that I want to note in terms of school loans, education loans, President Biden has forgiven about $200 billion worth of loans. That's off of a $1.2 trillion stock. So there's still a lot of debt out there, but good headway is being made. Another thing that I'm seeing in the data is we're getting more defaults, delinquencies on credit. Right, so here are transitions into delinquency of 30 days or more. And if you look at auto loans and you look at credit cards, we're seeing a significant uptick in delinquencies in those credit categories. Also seeing more delinquencies in terms of home mortgages, right? So this is a cause of concern that consumers might not be able to drive economic growth in the way that they have the last couple of years. Again, I don't think we're not headed to a recession. No way. One will come, but not soon. But we're probably headed to slower growth. All right. That brings us to labor markets, right? Just this morning, the numbers for April labor force growth, employment growth came out at 175,000 jobs. That's down from 335 in March, which was up from 236 in February. Right, so what we're seeing is a dramatic slowdown in employment growth in the US economy. And we're seeing a lot of evidence that labor markets are in fact cooling, right? And that's a good thing, right? Part of what's been holding the Fed back in terms of reducing interest rates is that the labor markets have been growing gangbusters and wages have been growing, and they fear that as a source of inflation. What we're seeing the number of job openings out there, as a percent of all jobs, the number of job openings out there has been falling pretty steadily, right? It's at levels that are still a little elevated relative to before the pandemic, but not much, right? We're also seeing that people are not quitting their jobs as often as they have over the course of the last couple of years. And if people are not quitting their jobs, that means that there aren't a ton of opportunities out there for them. More opportunities out there, more people quit and transition into something different, right? We're seeing less and less of that, right? So hopefully the job markets are cooling down a little bit, easing the Fed's fears. However, right, even though we've been growing jobs at a pretty rapid pace, we're still well below where we should have, could have, would have been. Right? It's another one of those graphs where the straight line up there is my projection of where employment might have gone had we not had a pandemic. And you can see that we're still about 5 million jobs below where we otherwise might have been. Now, you could probably argue with my projection that retirements and other changes in the labor force might have caused employment to be lower than my projection. Okay, but we're still probably a couple of million, 3 million, 4 million below where we otherwise would have been, right? And part of that is because I'll show you in a minute, the labor force, the number of people out there who want a job or have a job is growing more slowly too. The more I dig into these numbers, the more fascinating things I find, right? So what I think is pretty important for a lot of the conversation out there today is that almost all of the job growth relative to before the pandemic has come from immigrants, right? So here we've got the blue line is employment by native-born individuals. And the number on the far right-hand side there is 100.6. What that means is that employment among native-born individuals is 0.6% higher than it was before the pandemic. 0.6% higher than it was in February of 2020, right? That's almost no growth. We've had an increase in employment, but where that's coming from is it's coming almost entirely from immigrants. Immigrant employment is up about 10%, right? That's creating all of the growth in the US economy in the wake of the pandemic. Okay? Now, before the conversation turns to, well, that's because immigrants are coming and taking jobs away from Americans, let's have a look at the labor force. Right? So the labor force, here's again, the green line is where we are, the maroon line up there is where we might have been. We're about 3 million below where we might have been. A lot of people retired early. A lot of people exited the labor force, are suffering long COVID, or just don't want to go back into the labor force because they're still worried about COVID, right? So a lot of people have left the labor force for reasonable reasons, right? But it turns out that that's more true for the native-born population than it is for immigrants, right? The native-born labor force is unchanged from February of 2020. right? It would normally be going at a relatively slow but reasonable clip. It is unchanged, right? So all of the increase in the labor force is coming from immigrants. And that's why all of the increase in employment is coming from immigrants, right? So we want to think hard about the immigrant issue. We're not going to do that today because of time, maybe some other time. So another thing that everybody asks me about within these presentations, so I included, is what's going on with the stock market and stock prices, right? Well, what we saw over the course of the last couple of weeks is that the stock market did not like the inflation numbers. More on that, came out about 3.5% year-over-year growth. Stock market didn't like it. You know what the stock market did like? Stock market really liked today's jobs report. Right, because the number was so low at 175,000, almost a little bit more than half of what it was the month before, right? That's evidence the market's cooling. That gives hope in the stock market that the Fed is going to start lowering interest rates. More on that in a minute. Okay, so another minor point here is that in my view, the stock market probably a little bit overvalued. I don't think it's a real worry, but it gives me a little bit of pause. 50% growth in the S&P 500 over the course of the last 3 years, that's a lot. Right? But I don't want to dwell on that. Instead, let's turn to inflation. Let's talk a little bit about inflation and what's going on, and why I tend to be a little bit more sanguine than a lot of other people. Right? So first, here is the latest CPI numbers. Right? We have from March. We will have April in a couple of weeks. And year-over-year prices were up 3.5%. That's 1.5 points above the Fed's target. Fed wants us to get back down around 2. Now, just a moment on that 2% target is that 2% target is a little bit random. It's positive, and everybody agrees on that, but should it be 2%? Should it be 3%? I don't think that there's uniform agreement that one or another is better. Where 2% came from was that the head of the Federal Reserve equivalent in New Zealand came out and said, we're targeting 2%, and lots of other heads of Federal Reserve equivalent said, okay, we'll do 2%. Right? So 2%, we're going to work hard and we're going to get back there, but I don't think we're in trouble until we get there. So 3.5%, still probably high, but not too high. Where is that coming from? So this is the month-over-month change in prices. Up there at the top, you've got changes in car-related costs. Motor vehicle insurance, right up there at the top. That's month over month. Month-over-month increase was 2.6%. If you annualize that, that's up around a 30% increase year over year. I don't know how many of you have gotten your car insurance bill recently. I got mine a couple of weeks ago, and I about hit the floor. Right? Car insurance rates are going up, partly because motor vehicle maintenance and repair costs are going up. Supply chain and labor force issues are at work there. It's also true that we've been having more accidents lately. Right? I don't know if that's because people are driving more carelessly, people are driving a lot more. I don't know why it is, but we're having more accidents. So insurance rates go up. Another part of that is the cost of our housing. Right? Now, the way that the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, puts together that statistic means that it's going to lag reality significantly. Okay, so here, what I've got here, the orange line is Zillow asking rents. Right? It's a measure of, okay, when you go out there and you try to get an apartment, what are the rents that you're likely to face? That's what that orange line is. The blue line is the CPI shelter price index put together by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it comes down slowly because people are locked in. People are locked into a 12-month lease, usually, right? And that's what the BLS is using. It's not using asking rents, right? So I expect the housing component of the CPI to continue to come down. Now, it's going to continue to come down, but if you look at the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, the personal consumption expenditure price index, the housing component in that is much less than it is in the CPI. As a consequence, here's the PCE. As a consequence, the PCE price inflator is down around 2.7%. And that looks a lot better than the CPI does. And an enormous amount of the difference is because of the housing measure. Right? Okay, so housing measures, housing prices are going to come down. That's going to help the CPI come down. I don't know what's going to happen to automobile insurance, but most of what I see in the data indicate continuing declines in the CPI, absent those two, the motor vehicle category. Okay, so that's what the Fed is looking at mostly, is the PCE. And that helps me feel a little bit more sanguine about what the Fed might do. I don't think the Fed is going to contemplate raising interest rates. It may well not lower them yet this year, right? One thing the Fed is probably also concerned about are inflation expectations, right? If all of us sort of get it in our head that inflation is going to be a real thing, that increases the likelihood that inflation is going to be a real thing. We're all going to go to our bosses and ask for raises, and the boss is going to give us raises, and then we're going to go out and buy stuff. That's going to fuel price increases, right? And over the course of the last 6 months or so, we've seen inflationary expectations out there rise, right? That's another thing that's giving the Federal Reserve a little bit of cause for pause. That's a little bit troublesome. What isn't troublesome is wages relative to inflation. Now, this really depends on what measure you look at, but if you look at real, that's inflation-adjusted, non-supervisory wages, what you see is they're about 2.8% above where they were before the pandemic, right? So wages have, not always through the pandemic, but have caught up to inflation and exceeded it a little bit. Right, so people are still unhappy about inflation, still unhappy about prices. I think that part of what is causing people still to be unhappy about inflation and prices is that there's confusion about what inflation is. Right? Inflation is the year-over-year increase in prices, but I think a lot of people are looking at prices, overall absolute levels of prices, and they're high, and they think that inflation is still high. Right? So there's a real difference between high prices, and most of the categories here have seen price increases since before the pandemic in excess of 20%. That's a lot, but the number on top of each of the bars is the last 12 months worth of inflation in each category. And most of those numbers are pretty low. Housing is still high, but most of those numbers are pretty low. Right? Gasoline, 0.1%. CPI for food, 2.2%. Right? Not bad. Eggs are driving that number up for whatever reason, but still. Okay? There's also a mismatch. You know how everybody loves their congressman and hates Congress? Right, well, there's a similar mismatch between local economy and the U.S. economy. Right? The U.S. economy, 30% of people think the U.S. economy is worse now than it was a year ago. But ask them about their state's economy, right, and everybody says it's better. Right? I don't know exactly why that is, but I speculate that media has a lot to do with it. Right? Local economies are okay, put them all together, and they're not doing very well. Right? So I think that's part of the reason for the ill sentiment, especially about inflation. So some of my thoughts on the future of inflation, right? Most indicators suggest that we're going to get continued declines. Market expectations are worsening, and that's a little bit of trouble. That's going to slow any Fed action in the downward direction. I don't think we're going to hit 2% inflation probably until the early part, maybe middle of next year. It's going to take us a little while. Federal funds rate is going to stay high throughout this year probably, and popular expectations may take a little while to catch up with reality. Let's talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve. Right, the Federal Reserve has been pretty conservative throughout all this. I know that they were a little slow to get started. At least a lot of economists think that, and I'm one of them. But they've been pretty steady with their foot off the gas pedal for a while. They have two primary mechanisms that they use to influence inflation and the rate of growth of the economy. And the first is the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate, this is the rate that banks charge each other when they lend each other money overnight. Right? Why do banks lend each other money overnight? Well, because they're required to have a certain amount of cash on hand at the end of every single day. And some banks have too little, some banks have too much, so they lend it to each other. Right? And instead of having millions and millions of negotiations, this is just the interest rate that they use. Right? So if this federal funds rate goes up, that increases the costs for all of the other lending that banks do. So interest rates on everything goes up, on car loans, on home loans, on everything goes up just a little bit. And so we buy a little bit less stuff. that reduces demand, prices go up maybe less quickly than they otherwise would. There's the federal funds rate. Just on Wednesday, they announced that they weren't going to change it then. Next meeting is coming up in the middle of June. So the Fed also influences the economy through its holding of assets. Right? You can see during the pandemic over here, the Federal Reserve funded the $5 trillion worth of spending that the federal government engaged in, right, by buying treasuries, right? And that helps to ease the economy, to stimulate the economy. But what can contract the economy a little bit is quantitative tightening, right? If the Federal Reserve doesn't roll over its treasuries or sells some treasuries, reduces its asset holdings, right? That's gonna slow down the economy a little bit. So they've been doing that. A little bit behind the scenes, I don't hear that talked about very much, but it's tightening on the economy just a little bit instead of using interest rates, which I think is the right approach. What's the Fed gonna do? I can speculate all day long. I don't know. We'll learn a lot more in the middle of June when the Fed has its next meeting. They'll have a lot more information about inflation at that time. So one of the implications of inflation, of the federal funds rate going up, is that interest rates go up. Right? Primary among those for most of us is the mortgage interest rate. Right? And you can see the orange line on the bottom there. That's the federal funds rate. Pretty correlated. Federal funds rate goes up. Interest rates on home mortgages go up. Well, if interest rates on home mortgages go up, then home prices probably come down. And that's what we've been seeing a fair amount of. Right? So up here, I've got home prices for the 3 counties in the MBEP region, California and the United States. Up there is Santa Cruz. You can see prices peaked right around June of 2022, and we've seen significant declines. In that little morass of prices in the middle there is Monterey and San Benito and California, and down there at the bottom is the United States. So you can see that prices have more or less, I think, fallen from their peak back to their original trend. If you take a look at the Santa Cruz line, right, you could imagine a line that starts before the pandemic, before that blip, and just continues, and it might come pretty close to where prices are now. Right? So it looks to me like prices have substantially returned to their trend after the pandemic boost. So that's a little glimpse into MBEC data. We'll do far more of that. Just a little shameless promotion. I have that data and all the other data that I'm going to show you for the MBEP regions for every county and most cities in the state of California. So if you're interested in any of that, just give a shout. I'd be more than happy to share it with you. Okay, so takeaways. Are we headed for a recession? No. Ultimately, there will be one. There always is one somewhere in the offing, but I'm not worried about it through this year. Many indicators are still in the black. 2023, good. First part of this year, less good, but for reasons that don't make me worry. Again, it's inventories. Inflation, right? It's trending in the wrong direction the last few months. I think that's going to turn around, but time will tell. I'm not that worried about it. Housing and insurance, again. I don't know what's going to go on with car insurance, but housing is going to be less and less of an upward pull on inflation. Fed policy, going to continue to push against it for the rest of this year. Hopefully we'll see some declines in next year. Likely, again, to recover 2%, not until early mid part of next year. Okay, so uncertainties, there's the conflict in Ukraine and Israel. Oil prices, lately they've been okay. Actually, from February to March, they ticked up a bit. But if things go wronger in Ukraine and Israel, oil prices could be hurt. Aid to Ukraine and Israel, we're going to give it. Asset prices, again, I think that they might be a little bit overvalued. Household balance sheets are starting to give me some pause. And Fed action in a political year. My inclination is to think that Jerome Powell is going to continue to steer the ship in the direction that Jerome Powell thinks the ship should be steered in, and is not going to use policy to influence the election. I feel pretty confident in that. And Lori Kletzer down here is nodding her head too, so that makes me feel better as well. So what's going on locally? Locally, in terms of GDP growth, over there on the far left-hand side, that's GDP growth. Blue is MBEP, red is California, and green is the United States. And you can see that from a GDP perspective, the primary measure of the size of the economy, MBEP is doing about the same as California, which is doing about the same as the United States as a whole. There are specific categories where MBEP is doing a little bit better. In manufacturing and in leisure and hospitality. Leisure and hospitality, that's not all that surprising. And again, this is relative to before the pandemic. So the pandemic happened in between the 2 points of this growth. But manufacturing is a good thing. That's bringing good jobs to the region. And most of that manufacturing employment is happening in Santa Cruz County. I highlight another, transportation and warehousing, also growing a little bit more from a GDP perspective in the region. If we look at employment, right here, the graph on the left, the green employment, the green bars down there, that's farm employment in the region. And it's primarily, of course, Monterey County. The maroon bars, they do start at 0 and go up there to 267,000.9. That's non-farm employment. You add those two together, and you get the top number of 337,000 jobs in the region. Right? On the right-hand side, I've got non-farm employment. It has nearly caught back up to its pre-pandemic level, not quite there. And as I'll show you now, that's almost entirely because of what's going on in Monterey County. Santa Cruz and San Benito counties are still a little bit behind the 8 ball. So here, let's take a look at Monterey County. Over on the left, that's employment growth. Over on the right, that's labor force growth. Labor force growth is a pretty good driver of employment growth. If we don't get labor force growth, we don't get employment growth. The number there, 99.8 for Monterey County, means that it's down 0.2% relative to its pre-pandemic peak. The labor force over here, 100.3, it's up 0.3% relative to its pre-pandemic peak. Right, so Monterey County doing pretty well. If we look at San Benito County, not so well. In terms of employment, San Benito is 94.8. That means that employment is still down 5.2%. And you can see over the course of the last year or so, employment has been in decline. Labor force, similar decline. If we look at Santa Cruz County, similar picture, a little bit worse. Employment in Santa Cruz County is down 6.6%, right, relative to its pre-pandemic peak. Right, so outside of Monterey County, employment pretty sluggish in San Benito and Santa Cruz counties. If we look at employment patterns, so this is just the share of overall employment in the MBEP counties. Agriculture accounting for about a quarter of it. Agriculture is a little bit less than that. This includes forestry, fishing, and hunting. Right? Other big categories, leisure and hospitality, not a surprise. But given the large share that goes to ag, all the other shares are a little bit lower relative to California and the United States as a whole. If we look at changes in employment, right? First, changes in employment in manufacturing and changes in employment in information. Now, if you're going to get outsized changes in employment, those are two really good industries in which to get outsized changes in employment. So that bodes well for the economy. And a lot of that, again, is in Santa Cruz County. Caltrans annually puts out forecasts of employment. So here's the Caltrans format. Caltrans is very optimistic, I think, about employment in the MBEP region. They have it growing to about 400,000. I think that's very optimistic. Primarily, I think it's very optimistic because they also have a forecast of population that suggests that we're not going to get a whole lot of population growth in the MBEP regions. Right? And that's a cause for concern. If you don't have the population growth, it's really hard to get the growth in jobs. Right? So there's a little conflict there. I wanted to put them both up, mostly to emphasize that population growth in the MBEP region is going to be sluggish for some time. We can look back over the course of the last couple of years. The navy blue line there is overall MBEP population. It's growth relative to 2010. Over here, we've got the 3 individual counties, and you can see that most of that growth was coming from Monterey and San Benito counties, not Santa Cruz County. Growth declines over the course of the last few years. If we look at migration over there on the left-hand side, if you look at the last 6 or 7 years, it's been primarily out migration. Right? The net migration is primarily out. We have some international migration coming in, but not enough to make up for people moving out of the region. If you look at the right-hand side, this is the total change in population, decomposed into natural change and migration. Natural change, that green line, that's a little bit troubling. It is sloping down, which means that the population births are not replacing deaths within the region. We're having more deaths relative to births. That's partly because the overall population in the region is getting older. On the left-hand side there, you've got the change for various age categories over the course of the last 10 years, right? The only increase in population has been in the age group 65 and over, and they're not having kids to replace population. On the right-hand side, this is the forecast for the next 10 years, right? Forecasting more aging, right? I can compare this to what's going on in the Bay Area as a whole, right? And it's much the same. It's a little bit different because the Bay Area is getting some population growth of people in their 50s and low 60s, but not terribly different, right? Just to go back, they're very similar. Okay? And it's a population change that's happening in a great many places. There are forecasts that say that overall in the United States, the net increase in population after about 2034 is going to be negative outside of immigration. The natural change in population is going to be negative within a decade and a half. Okay. The poverty rate, I was looking up the poverty rate because I expected it to be a little bit high, and that would give me something to talk about, but it's a little bit low, which is terrific. The rate of poverty in the MBEP region is lower than it is in California, lower than it is in the United States. I didn't include the graph because of time, but it's also terrific that most of the poverty in the MBEP region is amongst adults, not children. Nationwide, the child poverty rate is significantly higher than is the adult poverty rate, right? So you've got an inversion here that's really, really terrific. People also like the statistics on working from home, and you can see that it peaked in about 2021, and it's coming down in 2022. I won't have 2023 data until this fall, right? My own projection on what's going to happen with working at home is that it's going to go back to some place that's closer to where we were before the pandemic than to where we were in 2021. Right? There's a reason that we were there before the pandemic, and I think that those reasons are going to become increasingly evident. And in particular, the young folks are going to recognize that, oh, as I'm building my career, it's really, really good to interact face-to-face with people. So we'll see more of that. So Monterey Bay Area summary, a couple of notes. Home prices have returned, I think, to trend growth. Aging population, that's going to require immigration to grow employment, to grow the population. But I think that that's going to be difficult. I'm not sure exactly where that's going to come from. Employment recovery is relatively slow. Monterey County, again, doing okay. San Benito and Santa Cruz counties, both a little bit behind the 8 ball. And poverty rates are nice and low in the region. Okay, that's what I have. Just a note, I will be sending a link to these slides to Tara, who I hope will send them out to all of you. There are a bunch of slides beyond my closing slide that have lots of other information that I left out because of time. So I encourage you to go and have a look. And if you find any of that interesting or something you'd like to know more about, please feel free to give me a shout, and I'd be delighted to talk with you about it.
Thank you, John. So now the fun, exciting part. We are also very excited to have Dr. Kletzer with us. She's a campus provost at UC Santa Cruz and the executive vice chancellor, and happens to be also a labor economist. So this will be exciting to the question that she may pose. And if we have time, we will also run a mic out to the audience for any other questions. So start thinking about what you might want to ask. And again, thank you to Lori and John.
Thank you, Tara. So, let me get my mic on. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right, so first, I want to ask all of you to join me. Thank you, John. That was fabulously illuminating, really terrific. I heard, so this is to all of you as the audience, I can see many themes and threads and points of light and points of worry from John's talk into our local area. So I have a few questions that I will start us off with, that I will ask of John, and we'll begin this morning fireside chat. But this is all a welcome and encouragement to all of you to think about what your questions are, because we will run some mics, because I, and John too, I think we're just really curious and want to welcome you to bring your questions to this. So, boy, there was just so much there, John, that I just really deeply appreciate. And I also appreciate the way in which you made it all very accessible, and in a way that more than sprinkled your perspectives and opinions into the presentation of the facts. You know, I think both of us know, as people who've been in the classroom, that it can be it can be a challenge to enliven economic presentations like this. And I think one of the ways you do that is you're very clear about what your perspectives are, and that you're not afraid, and that you're not afraid to offer some opinions. So I noticed myself reacting, as you can tell, to your walk through what the national economy looks like, right? Particularly your walk through at this moment, how we think about inflation and how we think about where we are in regard to inflation. I'm a labor economist, so I could sit here for days and talk about the labor market. So I will try not to do that, but I particularly appreciate it at the national level, your sense that where we really are is with a healthy labor market. I will say that the smile on my face diminished a little bit as you turned to the trends for the local economy, particularly when we think about population growth and labor force growth. So that's also a little prod to all of you to really, we welcome those questions. So let me ask mine. So I want to actually rip something from the headlines that's related, of course, John, to what you talked about. You know, our post-pandemic recovery really is complete. And I really appreciated the way in which you said, you know, eventually there is a recession out there, but it is not there now, right? And that, in fact, in many ways, maybe not all and maybe not exact, the post-pandemic recovery is complete. You know, we have a low unemployment rate, we have pretty healthy labor force participation, and healthy wage growth, and wage growth that's really kind of caught up with inflation. Any thoughts that you'd like to share with us on the kind of how and why of that a healthy economy seems not to be the public's perception, right? That, and you offered some of that, but I guess I'm asking you to dig in a little, and I'll put you on the spot. One of the states you didn't profile in that slide that characterized healthy economy, yeah, but not so much nationally, but yes, locally. One of the states missing was California. So can I poke you a little bit on this healthy economy is a mixed perception, and anything you might add about California?
Sure, but first, thank you so much, Lori. I appreciate your thoughts about my talk. One of my little taglines is to provide edible economics. Economics that's easily digestible. There are too many people out there who are trying to sound a lot smarter than they are and say things in ways that people just can't understand it. I try not to do that. And yes, one of the main benefits of being self-employed is that you can speak your mind and without really being worried about getting fired. So I do like to include, you know, not all of my opinions, but a smattering of them. Now, as for why there's this huge disconnect between local and the nation, and California, right? So I mercilessly stole that slide that graph from somebody else, and it did not have California, which is unfortunate. But I think probably the same holds in California, that people feel better about where they are rather than the nation as a whole. And you know, part of the problem of having such a big country is that so much bad stuff happens in it. And combine that with the fact that so much local media is dying off, our perspective gets shaped more by the national media than it does by what's happening locally, right? And I have this soapbox about people feeling safe or not. And I like to say that if California were its own country, we would feel safer than given that it's a part of something that's 10 times larger. right? Because there are more murders in the nation than there are in California, more abductions, more of everything that bad that happens reported on in the national news than in the local news, right? So I think that that's part of it, right? Our sense of how things are where we are is a result of our experience and talking with our friends and family about how their experience is, but then we turn to the national news and, oh, inflation's really high, egg prices are going up, car insurance rates are going up, and we get a distorted negative sense of the way that the nation is going. So that's a big part of my thoughts on why there is this disconnect. A big part of it is the death of local news, or at least the dearth of it relative to national news. National news, I'm sure we've all heard the tagline, if it leads, it bleeds. Right? So really, really positive news doesn't so much make it up into the headlines. It's the negative stuff. And I think that drives a lot of how we feel about the economy.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. Immigration. If we can, one of the things that I feel as an economist, yes, and also as a human being, that how immigration benefits the economy is very many times absent from the kind of hot button contemporary conversation. You know, you often hear that immigration benefits immigrants, but you often hear the worries about immigration, certainly at the national level, and I would say probably at the local level. The thing you don't hear very much about is how immigration benefits the economy. So I invite you to pick up that piece. But I want to highlight that your particular take on it, right, that is, particularly as we look at population growth and look at labor force growth, without immigration, right, we would just be, we would be flat, as you pointed out. So I'm going to push you a little bit, maybe outside of economics and into kind of public policy advocacy. But so first is the invitation, whether you agree or not, right, that there are in fact enormous benefits to immigration, and they are absent from the particular conversation that we're in, right? But when you add in, particularly for our area, right, that without foreign-born and in an area with net migration out, right, the role of immigrants is, let me use a technical word, enormous, right? And how do we, John, how do we influence that conversation in a way that moves it maybe closer to what I like to call the facts, right? And into this understanding, because, clearly that's of enormous interest and importance to this local economy, right? Those long-term trends tell us that.
Yeah, so I fundamentally agree that immigration is a net positive force for the economy. It's not positive and beneficial for everybody, though I think that the common narrative overplays its hand with respect to the negative impact, right? So let me go back to the positive impact. There's a movie that came out, I think maybe 15 years ago, called A Day Without Immigrants. Right? And I see some people nodding their heads, and if you saw the movie, right, our lives collapse, right? We rely on immigrants for so much. If we go out to eat for lunch, we're probably relying on immigrants to serve us. Our lawns are all going to grow to unsightly heights because we rely on immigrants in California to mow our lawns, to clean our houses, for so many things. So the benefit to a large part of society is abundantly clear, and there are enormous additional benefits. I could wax on about this for about 45 minutes, but I don't think Tara would appreciate that. At the bottom, right? So there's authorized immigration, there's unauthorized immigration, there's unauthorized immigration from Asia, there's unauthorized immigration from south of the border, and each one of those pieces is a different story, right? So the unauthorized immigration from Asia, most of those folks have at least a preponderance of those folks have at least a college degree. Great many of them have a college degree. So they're adding labor at the top end. If we think about unauthorized immigration from south of the border, the vast majority have less than a high school diploma. So let's focus in on coming from the south of the border, because those are the ones who have the negative impact that's out there in the common narrative. That, right, they come across the border, they're taking jobs from Americans who otherwise would work those jobs. A lot of people think that they're taking jobs that Americans don't want. I think there is an enormous component to that. Witness the last couple of years of job growth. But it likely is true that a bunch of low-skilled immigrants coming into the country will lower the wages of low-skilled native-born Americans, right? And it's not one for one, right? Because if you think about it, if a low-skilled, unauthorized immigrant comes into the country, the people that they're going to impact the most are the low-skilled immigrants that came into the country yesterday or last month. Next, they're going to affect disadvantaged minority communities, and then we get into to native-born low-skilled workers, right? So there's a dissipation of the effect before it really gets to native-born low-skilled workers. There is a negative impact. That negative impact, however, is, I believe, overwhelmingly swamped by the positive influence. The positive influences run to so many different potential avenues that I'll only mention one, right? Imagine a couple where both mom and dad are lawyers, right? And they have kids, and healthcare is expensive, so one of the adults is going to take time out of the labor force, and we all know that in this country it's more likely to be mom than dad who's going to take time out of the labor force, is not going to work as hard, is not going to climb up the ladder as quickly as is dad. Well, if we have an influx of unauthorized or otherwise low-skilled immigrants who are pushing down the costs of childcare, now mom is going to be freed up to provide her services to the labor force, to the economy, which is not only really great for mom, but it's also really good for the economy, because then we have skilled labor not sitting on the sidelines, but contributing directly to economic statistics, if not overall output, right? Because home service is very important for overall output.
John, thank you for that. So let me ask a question that grows the circle a little bit from that. I had this question before you were talking, and then I'm the only one who knows my question, so I see the link to where you just finished. For this, as you pointed out in your talk, housing is, as Tara opened our morning, right, with housing. And I particularly think, of course, about affordable housing and the impact of affordable housing on families, right? When you particularly think about families at low-income working class, right? And so one of the links from housing to where you finished, right, is when immigrants, particularly unauthorized immigrants, can get that foothold in the labor market, which then allows them to be able to eventually get into some affordable housing. The impact of affordable housing access on families, I can link to successes in the pre-K to 16 space, right? The stability that comes to families is clearly very beneficial to children. And I will say even prenatal, Tara, thank you for saying that it's really prenatal to 16. And then I can see that in terms of workforce development, right? That stability that comes to families from housing goes into the educational sector, which is very much related to workforce development. Those low-skilled, often women who can get childcare education, right, and enter into the skilled parts of the childcare workforce can have and in not very many years, can begin to have a real impact, right, on the costs of childcare. One of the things we know post-pandemic is that the childcare market is in crisis, right? The pulling back of federal pandemic funds, the closing of childcare expenses and childcare access has just collapsed. We see it at UC Santa Cruz. It is a childcare crisis. We need to be thinking, right, multi-year about how we can address that. So again, housing, impact on families, pre-K to 16, workforce development. those are the issues I think that this local labor market is really thinking about. Could any of this is where my question is really the speculative one. Could any of this wishful thinking actually have enough in it that it might be able to address some negative trends in net migration and begin to have an impact on what is now a pretty lopsided, and I can say this because I'm clearly part of that age group, pretty lopsided population and really lopsided workforce, many of whom are going to retire. So this is an invitation to you, John, to kind of go back to housing and think about that, particularly for this local region.
Yeah, so I'm stealing this.
It's a stem winder of a question. I apologize for that.
and it's another issue on which I could go on for a long time. But I think we have about 3.5 minutes left. So housing, I'm stealing this from some organization, I don't remember which, but housing is fundamental. It really is fundamental for growing an economy. If you look, before my talk started, we were looking at the year built at our table, the year built in parts of the MBEP community. And in Santa Cruz, 1970s were the heyday of home building, right? In the decades since the 1970s, not that much, right? And so, we've all been NIMBY and banana. Everybody know the term banana, build absolutely nothing at all near anything. Right? NIMBYism and bananaism has carried the day in California for, I think, probably the last 3, maybe 4 decades. And so, absent a lot of policy influence, we're going to be in a deep hole for a long time. But we're not living in California absent enormous policy influence. Sacramento has taken the baton and is leading the charge for more housing development. And I think that in the coming decade, we're going to get an awful lot more housing built. Now, the problem with that is that we're not going to get the housing built that we want. I am on the Planning Commission in San Rafael, and our authority has been largely gutted by state legislation. Our ability to say no is almost erased, which I find really unfortunate, but it's not a really surprising outcome of 30 years of saying no. Right? We have an enormous problem. Housing is fundamental. We're not building it. We're not providing it in an affordable way. But hopefully, along with a lot of hopeful thinking, we're getting policy action up in Sacramento that will pretty slowly change the environment. So I am optimistic about housing in California. Yeah, I had another point, but it escapes me.
That's all right. That's fine. So we don't have a whole lot of time. I did welcome your questions. So Tara, can we run a mic? Would anyone like to ask a question? Run your hand up, and we'll get a mic. Right? Are we? Okay. And if you would, please identify yourself before your question.
All right, do I get to go first? All right, well, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. Jeremy Howard with Pacific Gas and Electric Company. And thank you both. In hindsight, I should have been an economist. This stuff fascinates me. So if I could rewind and start college over again, I might choose a different career path. But nonetheless, my question revolves around the labor market, and it sounds like you both have some expertise in that area. And it seems like labor drives the potential for economic growth. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the AI revolution and whether or not that can substitute for a lack of labor growth.
Yeah. Okay, John, I'm going to let you answer first, but I want to say to this audience, one of the areas where John and I first met each other as economists was technology in the labor market and the displacement and growth effects. So thank you for this question.
Yep. We'll see what happens with AI, but I think all indications are that yes. It will help, right? So you need improvements in at least one of 3 things to get growth in the economy. You need more capital, right? Physical plant and equipment and stuff. You need more productivity, AI, and you need more workers, right? The workers are going to be increasingly hard to come by. The capital we'll see, and then there's productivity and AI. And I do think that AI is going to be productivity enhancing for a lot of individual workers. And it's going to replace some other workers. Hopefully that replacement will be the growth, the effective growth in the labor market that we need, but I'm not sure. It depends on how far we are able to go with AI. But I think from an overall economy productivity standpoint, I think AI is going to be a real positive.
And I share that perspective. Tara, can we do one more? Okay, get a hand up and.
I got the mic.
Okay, there you go.
I had a question and a comment. So the comment was, it was kind of hard to hear some of the language around the immigrant community and the way that they were characterized as only lower skilled, because we do know that there's a lot of higher skilled immigrants, and that we want to value and treat humanly the lower skilled immigrants as well. And so that's something I know we're really working on right here in our county, in terms of the regions Rise Together and Uplift, to come up with humane ways and ways to equitably treat our partners and our community members as they come in to help grow our economy. So I did want to make that comment. And in terms of the question that I had was around the comment you made that you feel like the Fed is going to not allow politics to impact their movement or change in the rates. And I wanted to understand a little bit better what that means to you, in terms of whether or not you think they're going to, what that means to you, and what you feel like that's going to look like.
Sure. Back to the immigration, I wholeheartedly agree with you. We need to treat immigrants better before they step foot across the border. But as soon as they step foot across the border, we need to treat them better there, and then we need to treat them better wherever they end up. But I could go on to how that's sort of a failing more broadly than just the immigration issue. That's just a glaring example of how the way that we treat less economically advantaged people in the United States. So your question about Jerome Powell. So if Jerome Powell wanted to throw the election to Donald Trump, he could probably jack up the federal funds rate. He's not alone in making that decision. There is a committee that makes that decision. So I think, it's a little bit difficult for him to do that, but it could happen. If they wanted to throw the election for President Biden, they could probably lower interest rates. They lower the federal funds rate, mortgage interest rates come down. I think if mortgage interest rates came down, that there would be a collective in the economy. And that would be super helpful. But I don't think that he's inclined to do either one of those things. I think that he and the Federal Open Market Committee, I think that they're reasonably focused on the right thing, trying to address inflation.
John, thank you. And again, how about a round of applause for our speaker? Thank you
very much. Thank you, Lori.